Thank you very much for the invitation to this conversation. I was thrilled and puzzled at the same time when the invitation came, and I was asking myself why ecofeminism once again, after its contested history in which I was personally pretty caught up. Firstly, your invitation made me realize that currently ecofeminism as a theory and a practice of resistance experiences a revival, in particular, and I would highlight in Latin America and in Africa to give an antipode to India. Thanks to Manisha for stressing the double character of ecofeminism being system of thoughts and ideas, the theory, and being a practice in movements. Presently, young activists from the Fridays for Future movement sometimes refer to ecofeminism without the slightest idea of the scholarly controversies in the concept, around the concept in the 1980s and 90s. My key assumption is that the present revival of ecofeminisms is based on ecofeminist movements. And I would say ecofeminist theories follow social movements. Secondly, as I worked a lot on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on our societal nature relations, the invitation encouraged me to link these considerations, which center a lot on care, to the substance of ecofeminisms and its transformative and emancipatory potentials. When I use the term ecofeminism in the following, I refer to the materialist version, which aims at structural, not only personal transformation in and of our economies, societies, and societal nature relations. In my understanding, it is an analytical and practical concept which speaks to power relations and challenges them. Let me start by recalling, now, why doesn't it move on? Yeah. Let me start by recalling briefly my own involvement in terms of consent and critique. In the second part, I will continue with a space and time specific diagnosis of recent trends in society-nature relations and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The crucial question for me now is what transformative and emancipatory potentials are in ecofeminism today. And I will conclude with highlighting the power of the body and the ecofeminist struggle to defend life from a Latin American perspective. As I said, and I can very much build on what Manisha has said before, I will interweave my personal feminist biography with the history of ecofeminism and the critique. In the 1980s, I met Maria Mies, Vandana Shiva, and Bina Agarwal because I was living in India. Afterwards, I worked for many years closely together with Maria in Cologne and still consider her as my teacher. Already in the beginning, the theory was inspired by social movements, the peace movement, protest against development politics, campaigns against nuclear energy, and Maria Mies herself founded the first women's shelter in Cologne. Let me first highlight what the different versions of ecofeminism have in common. Firstly, it's a construction of an analogy between the violent subjugation and oppression of nature and of women. Ecofeminism is a concept to counter the violence, and this is a key concept in ecofeminism of patriarchy and capitalist corporate-driven development, both personal and structural violence. This regime of violence was called rape culture which governs gender relations and society-nature relations. Secondly, women are supposed to be by nature, close to nature, closer than men, because they give birth and produce life. Third, all forms of life are interconnected, are very diverse, but interconnected, building a web of life. And fourth, the alternative, as imagined by Mies, Shiva, Veronica Benholt-Thompson, and others, was a subsistence perspective with a focus on self-sufficiency and off-market self-provision, which withdraws vital energies and resources from the imperatives of the exchange and competitive rationale of capitalist markets. Another commonality was the ecofeminist critique of science, technology, and development. And crucial was a critique of dualisms and dichotomies, women versus men, women equalized to nature, emotion, privacy, men equalized to culture, ratio, and the public. And what we would call othering today, this notion has not been there in the 80s and 90s, is the dualism of developed and underdeveloped world, regions of the world, of civilized, uncivilized regions and people, and for example, sexuality as well. The critique of science, technology, and society-nature relations was laid out very well by Caroline Merchant. The subjugation of nature was accomplished by technology and fragmentation in the lab. And the subjugation, there you have the parallelity once again, and the subjugation of women, of women's knowledge, their sexuality, was accomplished by witch hunting and torture, which has been analyzed by Silvia Federici very much. And this had a great relevance for the upcoming capitalist system, the primitive accumulation of capital. Now, this critique of technologies resulted in a deep techno-skepticism in ecofeminist thinking in the beginning, or a rejection of technologies, in particular modern technologies like genetic engineering and reproductive technologies, aiming to control women's fertility. An equivalent to women being close to nature is, of course, that they are not close to technology, that they are not affine to technology. This brings us to the crucial critical concerns raised vis-à-vis ecofeminism. And the crucial point of critique was essentialism. Essentialism because ecofeminisms had the assumption that all women are closer to nature, are caring, are by nature peaceful, life-producing and sustaining, distant to technology, and didn't take into account difference according to class, to caste, urban, rural, age, religion, race, ethnicity, and so on. So this is a very obvious lack of intersectionality, not everywhere in ecofeminist concepts, but very often, and it results in a homogenization and generalization of women and of gender relation and of human society nature relations. This essentialism caused a debate, a discourse, going back to Gayatri Spivak, about strategic essentialism, because the question is, if women, if feminists enter political spaces, how do they introduce and how do they present themselves? Can they represent all women? Can they say what the Women's Action Agenda 1991 did, that was in preparation of the UN conference on environment and development in Rio de Janeiro? They started a very, very strong and excellent declaration. They started, "We, women of the world." And Spivak asked, who is this we? I don't want to be part of this we. I don't want to be submerged in this imagined sisterhood. And this is a point as well where Bina Agarwal started her feminist environmentalism, criticizing these ecofeminist assumptions. The assumption, she said, that the assumption of about women's caring and healing capacities resulted in deepening gender hierarchies, not breaking them up, but deepening them. And the difference between men's and women's relation to nature, so Agarwal, is not based on biology, but on social factors and in labor. And regarding Vandana Shiva, who had somehow romanticized the pre-colonial Hindu culture as more equal and more balanced, Agarwal pointed out that the traditional Hindu culture was already structured by caste, land ownership, and gender, and highly hierarchical. Bina Agarwal's feminist environmentalism was followed by feminist political ecology, as mentioned earlier by Manisha already, which is very much intertwined with feminist political economy, and does a kind of ethnographic studies on the ground, which aim at not being essentialistic, but being intersectional, being very much contextualized in the local or regional specific context, and producing situated knowledge together with the local people, or in particular the women. The research focus is on gendered knowledge and knowledge production, on gendered rights and responsibilities, on gendered agencies, struggles, and social movements. And the key question is power. How is power generated? Through the access to and control of resources, including technology. So I got involved in this theoretical network and in this theoretical framework, and then published with them. And what I liked about them is that they don't present a kind of one and only solution to all the problems, as the early ecofeminism did with the subsistence perspective. But then I realized that feminist political ecology scholars research on women's agency, and they acknowledge organizing and resistance and struggles. But feminist political ecology, that's very clear, is not itself a social movement. But ecofeminism, and that is the difference to ecofeminism, is a social movement. Ecofeminism and strategic essentialism, this strategic essentialism of we women, is very much alive on, in particular, that's not true, not only on the international policy level. But I give you here an example from the international policy level, an organization called We Can, who is active with regard to international negotiations of climate change, for example, but calls and advocates local activities. And I quote here a bit of their programmatic statement, as they say, we are the mothers and the grandmothers, sisters and daughters, who stand together to care for all generations. We are teachers, scientists, farmers, fishers, healers, helpers, workers and business people, writers and artists, decision makers and activists, leaders and thinkers. We work in the halls of power, the halls of faith, and the halls of our homes. We are gathering to raise our voices to advocate for an earth-respecting cultural narrative, one of restore, respect, replenish, and to replace the narrative of domination, depletion, and destruction of nature. So you see, you hear this ecofeminist drive for essentialism and lack of intersectionality on the one hand. On the other hand, it is combined with really ecofeminist perspectives. Yeah, but the critique of essentialism, lack of differentiation and intersectional is still today valid as it had been at that time, not only in the academic area, but in organizing and movement building alike. Recently, Sherilyn McGregor, and I think she is teaching at University of Manchester, isn't it? And Aino Ozolameki published an ecofeminist critique of SDG 5, with a critique of the binary and dualistic approach to gender and to production and reproduction. Core strategy of the SDGs is the economic empowerment of women by giving them more opportunities and participation in the markets and prevailing macroeconomic policy framework and masculinist spheres. This is informed by a liberal gender equality approach, not by a transformative agenda, and not by a social and environmental justice concept. It's much more of an affirmative participation, but affirmative concept with regard to the whole system. Questioning feminization and devaluation of care would have been a very good political and analytical entry point for transformation and to challenge all oppressions, patriarchy, colonialism, racism, and imperialism. So here in this critique of the SDGs, you find again this thinking together different forms of oppression and much more in an intersectional way. Ecofeminist theories are supposed to have changed in the recent past and integrated a number of new academic and theoretical discourses. Various authors observed turns in ecofeminist thinking. Kings observed the intersectionality causes a changing face of ecofeminism. Analyse calls ecofeminism an ecofeminist political economy, focusing on appropriation and externalization of, in particular, women's unpaid work, on gendered and racialist society-nature relations, and on care work as countermodel of capitalist industrial modernity. She observes a broadening of the concept of human-nature relations via queer ecologies and new materialism. Kings and Save argue on the theoretical level, while Brownhill-Turner and Ruth Nyambura refer very much to resistance movements. Brownhill-Turner say ecofeminism is in the heart of eco-socialism. And they refer to indigenous women defending commons at the front line, and a class of women which are really pioneers in the struggles. And working class women, not only middle class women, struggle against sexual violence. So there are links made to Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movement. Ruth Nyambura from the African Ecofeminist collective is a brilliant scholar activist, and she stresses decolonization, and she challenges colonial borders and boundaries which are produced now in development policies, and she challenges the post-colonial power structures in development. Now, the new features of ecofeminism are as well a reaction made to recent trends in society-nature relations. And I would highlight only a few, which I think bring about really a new quality. And this is firstly, after the financial crisis 2008-2009, resource extractivism, which has already been there on a corporate level. But resource extractivism has been adopted now by many countries in the global south as a development path. And of course, it increases the commercialization of nature. Resource extractivism as a solution to the crisis situation, financial crisis situation, many countries have come in. So the crisis situation should be, this is saying it should be solved at the cost of nature. And not only commercialization of nature, but financialization of nature, going beyond the long-standing patenting and trade in intellectual property rights into trade in CO2 emissions and an economic validation of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And this comes along with an ecological modernization of the capitalist economy. Called, there are many nice headings for this, called Green New Deal, Green Growth, Green Economy, with the slogan, protect nature. So it is said, articulated, the protection of nature is articulated by putting monetary value on it. So this is the integration of the full integration of nature into the financial market. And another kind of modernization of economic modernization comes in, and this is due to digitalization. Society-nature relations and labor are digitalized more and more. For example, agriculture systems, it's called Agriculture 2.0, genetic manipulation of organisms 2.0, for example, with the crisp scissor, new technologies and synthetic biology. So there are many completely new technologies making for a change in the relation between humanity and nature. At the same time, we experience on the political level an erosion and a failure of multilateralism coming along with the rise of authoritarian nationalism. We had America first, we have India first, we have this first, we have that first. And this failure of multilateralism is dramatic, not related now to the war, not only related to the war, but have, for example, a look at the Paris agreement on climate change, which is not implemented at all. So where does humanity make its rules and regulations and laws to counter this destructive developments? On an economic level, presently, we experience a deglobalization, going along with a regionalization, but again with a very competitive nationalism as well. And I would like to mention here as well the subjectivity level. I think I should have stressed this in the beginning, but much more, that really one starting point for ecofeminism was the subjectivity of women, were the bodies of women. And on the subjectivity level, we have an ever-increasing individualism. I call it selfism, because in these millions of selfies we make of ourselves, focusing on ourselves. It's a new forms of self-centeredness where empowerment, in particular of women, or even emancipation, is understood as an optimization of the self in the market and adjusting it, being better in a better position to adjust it to market norms. So I think these trends are very relevant if we look at new ecofeminisms. Reacting as against these developments, in the past 20 years, a new theory practice gained ground, degrowth. It picks up earlier thinking about the limits of growth. As a systematic concept, it originated from the West and inspired social movements on the ground. It acknowledges the historic responsibility of the Western industrialized economies and colonial powers for climate change, and the imperial mode of living in the West and in the middle classes all over the world on the cost of others and of resources in the global South. It flags that humanity is reaching tipping points in many areas, for example, the extinction of species and indigenous local knowledge, CO2 emissions, peak oil and everything, which is because of the modernization paradigms, which started with Green Revolution and now continue with the Green New Deal and green economy and so on. Degrowth movements share the focus on local activities. Am I running short of time? Then I cut it.
No, you have 15-20 minutes.
Okay, fine. Degrowth movements share the focus on local activities as a bottom-up movement and adopted the slogan, "Many small people who in many small places do many small things can alter the world." On the one hand, this sounds naive if it goes along with an underestimation of structural power and powerful agents like corporations and capitalist states. On the other hand, it orients towards sufficiency as a counter-concept to the market principle of efficiency. Sufficiency in the mode of living and in the entire economy. This idea of sufficiency, of enough, along with care and commons, is driving the socio-ecological perspective of transformation. Care, commons, and enough are the building blocks here. I would like to mention the degrowth movement is not a predominantly feminist movement, but nevertheless, they have a lot in common. As said, the recent revival of ecofeminist movements and practices is a legitimate reason to look afresh on these movements and new currents of ecofeminist theories. My key questions refer to their potential to explain the topical crisis situations, which is very complex, and to inspire movements and alternative practices and thinking, in particular in the COVID-19 crisis. SARS Covid-19 has driven humanity in a deep crisis with regard to our individual and society-nature relations. In the West, starting with the so-called Enlightenment era, the hegemonic concept of modern society has been the rule of reason in societies over bodies and nature. This prevailing narrative of progress through the rule of reason and science drove as well the economy and its imperative of growth, which fires the capitalist mode of production and accumulation of wealth. Just as the climate crisis is primarily a consequence of the industrial overutilization of resources, zoonoses and mutations of viruses can ultimately be understood as the effect of violent interventions in natural environments, which aim to restructure nature according to vested interest and the profit interests of the economy. Both current examples, climate change and the pandemic, expose the destructive paradigm of the growth-obsessed, resource-intensive development and its depletion of resources and human bodies. It became very clear how autonomous the nature is and its obstinacy. It became very clear that our economic system has limits in commercialization and in its growth. And the global markets, which couldn't cater for the needs we had in the beginning of the pandemic, is profit-oriented and not need and provision-oriented. The pandemic exposed the vulnerability or made us feel, that's much more important, we felt it, the vulnerability of our life and of course of our livelihoods. It showed us and it deepened the crisis of social reproduction by increasing our vulnerability. And it showed us, made us understand the essentials of life. Because in the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, the banks, the financial system, always was called the essential of the system. And now it's very clear the essential of the system is social reproduction. If social reproduction is not working, then society and the economy will collapse. This meant in the end more care work for women and a deepening of what I call care extractivism, that society and the market, of course, extract care capacities from women. And it resulted in an appalling depletion of care workers' bodies. And we have seen the nurses completely exhausted with depressions, burnout during the pandemic. So you see, I'm coming back again and again to the bodies. And therefore, I return back. Having said that, the belief in the rule of reason as the ultima ratio has been deeply shaken by COVID-19 and was pushed aside by a strong feeling of losing control over their own body and over nature. In this multiple crisis situation, I would like to ask what perspectives or even ways out ecofeminism can potentially offer to us. And I go back to an old holistic perspective of ecofeminism of different environments, from the self, from the body, from the local to the global. And you see, starting from the body, we have this interconnected circles. And I like to quote an old statement by the South Network Dawn from 1992, where they said, because I find it has a lot of actuality now, our first environment is our body, our children, families, communities, and the earth that sustains us. Poor women's lives are not compartmentalized. Their work is not seasonal. Our capacities to sustain our livelihoods and care for our families, our link with our communities and the earth is being destroyed. Our knowledge of the earth and its care is being destroyed. The earth is being raped for profit. So here you have the same images and the same narratives coming up. But I quote it because I feel it's very topical nowadays. The concept of caring, which has been the centerpiece recently of socio-ecological debates about transformation. This concept was embedded in ecofeminist thinking and agency from the beginning. Reproduction and life-sustaining processes in household communities and in the nature are forms of caring for, of being concerned, of providing, and so on. And the problem, of course, is that this has completely been feminized. So this holistic perspective I framed by individual rights and common resources. So this has to be balanced very well. I just want to show once again that care has been embedded in ecofeminism from the beginning. You remember the feminine principle of Vandana Shiva, and Manisha talked again about the hugging of trees, of the Chipko. Carolyn Merchants and Plumwood talked about earth care and the ethics of earth care. Ariel Saleh called the logic of reproduction the barefoot epistemology of women from the South. Mary Meller said that social reproduction is the antipode to the economic man, the material relation between women and nature, embodied materialism. We have said it, Veronica Benholt-Thompson, Maria Mee's subsistence perspective is of course a caring perspective. And Sherilyn McGregor warned, and I fully agree, to romanticize this caring, as it has often been done in ecofeminism, but to politicize it, to make it a key point in feminist ecological citizenship. Melissa Leach clearly says the days of discourse on women as natural environmental carers passed. So as natural carers. So care has always been there, but now in this situation in this concept are tremendous potentials for a future perspective, for future ecofeminist and in general future perspectives for ecological transformation. Caring for human and non-human life is an essential in current ecofeminist movements as well. And I think we have heard already brilliant examples for this in Manisha's presentation. And I would like to turn first to Africa, where there is now a strong focus on resource justice. And it's important to talk about the justice notion, concept for a moment, because feminist movements were talking for decades about women's rights. And then Black feminists came up and said, equal rights for all women are not appropriate to the situation of Black women, poor women, marginalized women, and so on. Equal rights under unequal conditions enforce inequalities. And therefore they introduced, and they did it very much in the context of sexual and reproductive rights, they introduced the concept of reproductive justice, so that we have to see individual rights, equal rights in an unequal context and relate it there, and to justice to unequal conditions. Therefore here, the notion of resource justice. And I came first across this group in South Africa called Women, and they organized against mining. And there is a lot of mining in South Africa and all over Africa, industrial mining, corporate mining, pushing aside, of course, the livelihoods of women, which are mainly rooted in agriculture. So, and what the slogan they created for me is so powerful, that they say, we want to have a right, or we take the right to say no to this kind of development, to development project, and to our disappropriation to this kind of development. Women is now a network all over Africa, hailing from South Africa, but still, and as you read here, secure access to resources for life and livelihood is what their key demands are, at the same time reclaiming commons against the privatization, for example, of land. Women is part of the African ecofeminist collective, which I mentioned already earlier, related to Nyamburo. In Latin America, very much on the same line, La Via Campesina is struggling for food sovereignty. And La Via Campesina, a powerful international network of peasants, is really the front line of this network, and the basement are women, are female peasants, and is the Feminismo Campesino Popular, as it is called. They linked, and this is again these interesting links in ecofeminism, a campaign on violence, their struggles for food sovereignty, to a campaign on violence against women, because they said we cannot fight against the violence of development and the violence done to our land and our disappropriation of land rights if we won't talk about the violence in our families. And this was this breaking of silence in a macho culture was a very, very important point. And they clearly make statements against the liberal gender approach, saying gender equality is not sufficient to tackle problems like land grabbing, displacement, agro-industry, genetic engineering. There must much more come in. And their framework of reference is no more the prevailing hegemonic development concept, but these are alternative economic models and cosmovisions, like When Vivir, Pachamama, Soma Kausai, which are coming from indigenous communities and present alternative society-nature relations, which are mainly based on conviviality. And I would like to end by highlighting two prominent philosophers in Latin America, which are presently making these links which are needed in this, in this moment very much, make these links in their thinking, and both of them are very much rooted in feminist movements. Rita Segato links struggles against violence, and this is very, very prominent now in Latin America. The femicides, there's a very high rate of murders of women and violence, rapes and violence of women. She relates this with coloniality, modernity, and territoriality of power, and has introduced this notion of concept of territoriality and says the body is women's territory and it is conquered by colonial masculinity. And she doesn't mean only the colonial powers, but colonial masculinity is masculinity adopted in Latin America as well. It is women's territories. The body is conquered like land is conquered. She criticizes the Eurocentrism and the intellectual dominance of Western knowledge and knowledge systems and calls this epistemic violence. She highlights how psychic, material, symbolic violence enforces gendered and racialized asymmetries in societies and makes us understand the centrality of violence by analyzing the intertwinement of patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. Veronica Gago, on similar lines, links struggles of social feminist movements with violence of neoliberalism and extractivism, and presents a feminist reading of financialization and debt, and highlights alternatives in popular economics based on solidarity and collectivity. And to wind up, ecofeminism, I would agree, after you forced me to make a presentation here and to go deeper in this, ecofeminism has a lot of potential for a concrete utopia in this complex crisis situation of humanity and a kind of umbrella movement. And I strongly would stress that the revival of ecofeminism is driven by social movements, and their success is a synergy of single issue organizations. They present a counter-narrative to the rule of reason, to the economic man, to growth-oriented economy and development, to the globalization of markets, a counter-narrative to resource extractivism and the lack of problem-solving capacities of the market. The economy always and the states look for solutions in the market, and this is the wrong development path. They propagate violent-free sovereignty instead of the logic of capital, market dependencies, and social inequalities. against commercialization of everything, against the rule of individual profit-making, and stress commons, solidarity, and conviviality. So I think in this we can find a lot of points to build on, and a lot of points where we can develop some hope in this very difficult situation. And since we actually, my understanding that we are talking all the time about power. To finish here, I would like to show you a short video of the power of feminist movement, of the feminist movement in Latin America. And this is the power which starts again from the own from the own body, in the movement against violence against women's bodies and femicides. Okay, you got an impression what I wanted, of the message I wanted to convey. Thank you very much for your attention.